Putin may have thought he had already seen the worst Ukraine could throw at his army. He was wrong. Russia's troops are now facing a devastating new threat on the battlefield, and it comes from one of the most powerful artillery systems ever built by the United States. Quietly, without major fanfare, Ukraine has added a fearsome Cold War-era weapon to its arsenal, and it could force a major shift in how this war is fought. The 203mm M110 self-propelled howitzer has arrived in Ukraine, and for Russian troops already struggling through brutal frontline conditions, that changes everything. According to United 24 Media, the 52nd Artillery Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces has confirmed that it has received the 203mm M110A, placing it alongside domestically produced artillery systems already being used to tear through Russia's spring offensive. In a social media post published on April 2nd, the brigade stated that its equipment includes the 2S-22 Bodana self-propelled howitzer, RM-70 Vampire multiple launch rocket systems, and the 203mm M110A. The announcement was casual. The implications are anything but, because this is not just another artillery transfer. This is the arrival of a weapon built to smash hardened targets, devastate troop concentrations, and deliver immense explosive force deep into areas Russia thought it could still protect. Ukraine may not even have expected to get a system like this. Russia almost certainly did not expect it either. But thanks to a weapon developed by the United States decades ago, Ukraine now has an artillery monster that could leave Russian positions shattered and exposed. That raises the obvious question: how did Ukraine get its hands on M110 howitzers at all? Officially, this is a retired U.S. military system, a Cold War relic many would assume had no place in a modern war. But retired does not mean useless, especially in a conflict where trench warfare, attritional assaults, fortified positions, and mass troop attacks have made older heavy artillery terrifyingly relevant again. The answer appears to trace back to a deal reported in October 2025. Army recognition stated that Greece approved the transfer of 60 U.S.-made M110 artillery systems to Ukraine, along with 150,000 rounds of ammunition and Zuni rockets, in an agreement believed to be worth 199.4 million euros, just under $230 million. The systems were to be delivered through the Czech Republic and transferred without major modification or refurbishment. On paper, that might seem like Greece was offloading outdated hardware. In reality, Ukraine was acquiring a large number of brutally effective heavy artillery pieces that remain more than capable of causing catastrophic damage on a battlefield like this one. The M110 is not modern in the sleek, digitized sense. It is not a precision wonder weapon built for a clean, high-tech war. It is something else entirely. It is a blunt force instrument of destruction, designed to deliver enormous explosive power fast. And in a war that often looks less like a 21st century campaign and more like a return to industrial age battlefield brutality, that kind of weapon still matters enormously. There may be even more of them available. Army recognition notes that Greece has operated the M110A2 since the early 1980s and reportedly possessed around 145 units before deciding to transfer 60 to Ukraine. For decades, the system served as Greece's long-range artillery solution, but as Athens modernizes around standard NATO 155mm systems, the M110 has become surplus. For Ukraine, that surplus became an opportunity. And it is not just the guns themselves that matter. The ammunition package makes the transfer even more significant. United 24 Media reports that the deal includes 50,000 high-explosive M106 rounds, 40,000 rocket-assisted M650 rounds, and 30,000 each of the M509A1 dual-purpose cluster munitions and M404 improved conventional munitions developed later in the M110 service life. That means Ukraine is not just receiving heavy artillery. It is receiving heavy artillery with flexibility. These howitzers can hit troop concentrations, harden positions, and rear area targets with a variety of munitions suited to different battlefield roles. Naturally, that leads to another critical question. Could Ukraine get more M110s? Based on reported Greek stockpiles, the answer appears to be yes, at least in theory. If Greece's remaining systems are still in workable condition, there could be roughly 85 more available for transfer. Whether another deal happens remains to be seen, but the logic is clear. Greece sees the M110 as obsolete for its own evolving defense posture. Ukraine sees it as a highly destructive solution against a Russian military that is still relying heavily on massed assaults, slow battlefield advances, and deeply entrenched positions. Then there is the question of whether the United States could become a source as well. Since the M110 is an American weapon, and because NATO countries now have a mechanism for purchasing U.S. weapons for transfer to Ukraine through the Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List, or PEARL, it is natural to wonder whether this system could eventually be sourced from U.S. stockpiles too. PEARL has already become an important pipeline for military support. By December 2025, NATO allies had reportedly funded more than $4 billion in packages for Ukraine through the initiative. The advantage of the mechanism is simple. Ukraine identifies what it needs, and partner states fund purchases accordingly, allowing aid to be directed toward actual battlefield requirements instead of whatever donor states happen to offer. If the M110 proves effective enough in combat, PEARL could become a pathway for securing additional units. The uncertainty is whether the United States still has usable systems to offer. Deagle reports that the U.S. produced around 1,100 M110 howitzers after introducing the weapon in 1963. It also notes that variants of the system have remained active in countries such as Turkey, Spain, Bahrain, Morocco, Jordan, and Greece. Some of those countries, especially Spain, could theoretically become future sources for Ukraine. But the American situation is less clear. Although some data sources list contradictory information about the M110 status, it is widely understood that the U.S. military retired the system in the 1990s, leaving the M109 as its principal self-propelled howitzer. So what happened to those American M110s? At least some of their barrels were repurposed. Real Clear Defense notes that during the Gulf War era, spent M110 barrels were used as makeshift casings for GBU, 28 bunker-busting bombs. But that still leaves open the question of whether the underlying artillery systems were scrapped entirely or whether some remain in storage in some form. If the latter is true, and if Ukraine's partners were determined enough, one could imagine a scenario in which remaining chassis or components could be restored or adapted. For now, though, that remains speculation. What is not speculative is the battlefield impact these guns can have right now. The arrival of the M110 in Ukraine has the potential to shift frontline dynamics wherever it is deployed. That is what transforms it from an aging Cold War relic into a genuine battlefield asset. And if you are paying attention to how wars are actually won or lost, this is exactly the kind of development that matters most. Before going deeper, if you are enjoying this analysis, make sure to subscribe to the Global Brief so you never miss the next major shift on the battlefield. So what exactly does the M110 bring to Ukraine? First, and most obviously, it brings raw destructive power. Ukraine has had artillery throughout the war, of course, but the M110 adds a heavier class of punishment. Each shell delivers around 90 kilograms, or roughly 198 pounds, of explosive force. With rocket-assisted ammunition, that destructive force can reach targets up to 30 kilometers away, giving Ukraine the ability to hammer Russian positions with massive shells from significant distance. That firepower comes with mobility as well. The M110 is mounted on a tracked chassis powered by a 405 horsepower engine, allowing it to move, fire, and reposition. That means Ukraine is not dealing with a static siege gun fixed in place. It has a mobile heavy artillery platform that can support shifting battlefield demands and reduce its vulnerability through movement. There are trade-offs. Army recognition notes that each M110 requires a crew of 13 personnel. 5 operate the vehicle directly, while the rest support ammunition handling and movement, typically using accompanying cargo vehicles. That is a large manpower commitment, and it helps explain why the M110 is being assigned to artillery brigades built to sustain that logistical burden. The gun itself elevates from -2 to 65 degrees and traverses 30 degrees left and right. It also includes manual backup controls in case the hydraulic systems fail, which means Ukrainian crews will need specialized training to operate it effectively. And it is not especially fast firing by modern standards. The M110 typically fires 1 round every 2 minutes, although under intense conditions it can reportedly reach 2 rounds per minute. That rate is limited in part because the system carries only 2 rounds on board, meaning resupply and reload procedures matter greatly. So no, this is not a flawless wonder weapon. But it does not need to be. It hits so hard that its limitations become easier to accept. On the battlefield, the M110 functions less like a rapid-fire scalpel and more like a sledgehammer. It is the devastating haymaker thrown behind the faster, more precise artillery punches Ukraine is already landing with its other systems. That leads directly to another reason this transfer matters so much: value. Ukraine did not simply receive a symbolic batch of old guns. It acquired an immense amount of firepower for a comparatively low price. Just based on the ammunition package alone, the $230 million total works out to a remarkably low cost per round, especially when considering the destructive power involved. Defense Express reports that Greece valued each M110 at around €520,000, or roughly $599,000. Multiply that by 60 systems, and the cost of the howitzers themselves comes to about $35.9 million. That means the remainder of the price reflects a huge volume of ammunition, driving the effective cost per shell down to an exceptionally affordable level given the damage each one can inflict. In other words, Ukraine has acquired a system that can pay for itself very quickly on the battlefield. A handful of successful strikes on Russian armor, troop concentrations, logistics nodes, or fortified positions could justify the investment immediately. That matters for a country fighting under enormous financial pressure after years of war. Even with major promised support from European partners, Ukraine still faces immense budgetary strain. Any system that helps keep costs lower while inflicting disproportionate damage on Russia is strategically valuable. But perhaps the most important advantage of the M110 is not just its power or its price. It is how well it fits into Ukraine's broader artillery ecosystem. The 52nd Artillery Brigade already fields the domestically produced 2S-22 Bodana, a precision long-range howitzer suited to striking command centers, ammunition depots, and fixed targets deeper behind Russian lines. It also operates the RM-70 Vampire, a multiple launch rocket system ideal for saturating troop concentrations and assault formations. The M110 now slots between those systems in a way that creates a far more layered artillery structure. The RM-70 can tear apart massed assaults and clustered vehicles. The M110 can demolish hardened or high-value targets that require heavier explosive force. The Bodana can then reach deeper into the Russian rear and strike logistics, command, and infrastructure. That creates a powerful chain of battlefield disruption. Frontline assault units get hit first. Rear support positions get smashed next. Then the deeper logistical and command architecture feeding those assaults gets degraded. It is a system of artillery depth that makes Russian offensives harder to sustain at every stage. That is especially important given where the 52nd Artillery Brigade is operating. Militarny Eye reports that the brigade is active in eastern Ukraine, where it provides fire support, conducts counter-battery missions, and targets Russian logistics. Defense Express adds that it is operating in the Kharkiv and Kramatorsk sectors, areas where the M110 may already be in combat use. Kramatorsk, in particular, is critical. It is one of the major cities in the Donetsk fortress belt, a heavily defended zone stretching along a key highway corridor. Located in the northern portion of that defensive network, Kramatorsk plays a central role in Ukraine's effort to block Russia from fully seizing Donetsk and, ultimately, the broader Donbass. Ukraine has spent more than a decade reinforcing this region since Russia's original aggression in 2014. That already made Russian advances costly. With the arrival of M110s, any troop buildup, staging area, or hardened position linked to a push toward Kramatorsk now faces the risk of overwhelming artillery fire. And Ukraine has 60 of these howitzers. It is highly unlikely that all of them are concentrated in one brigade. That means more M110s are likely being positioned for use elsewhere, and their ammunition variety opens up even more tactical options. Take Ukraine's kill zones as an example. These are some of the deadliest defensive areas anywhere on the front, designed not just to stop Russian advances, but to destroy them in depth. United 24 Media has described these zones as layered traps filled with anti-tank obstacles, anti-personnel defenses, mines, ditches, dragon's teeth, barbed wire, drones, and tunnel networks built to support ambushes. For Russian troops, entering one of these areas can mean walking into a controlled slaughter. But these kill zones are not just static barriers. They are designed to shape battlefield movement. If Russian troops cannot go through them, they have to go around them. That funneling effect channels assault units into predictable open spaces where Ukraine can strike with artillery and drones. FPV drones tear into exposed armor. Artillery shells rain down on trapped units. Now add the M110 into that equation. A nearly 200-pound shell landing in one of those funnel points would be catastrophic. Against troops already stalled, exposed, and under drone surveillance, the M110's explosive force could magnify the lethality of Ukraine's defenses dramatically. And that is what makes this weapon so dangerous for Russia. Moscow's offensive tactics remain heavily dependent on pushing manpower and equipment through brutal ground assaults. Those methods already produce horrific losses. Against an artillery system like the M110, they become even more disastrous. That is why this old weapon suddenly matters so much. Russia is fighting in a way that has made the M110 relevant again. Slow advances, concentrated assaults, fortified rear positions, and grinding battlefield attrition all play directly into the strengths of a heavy gun built for punishing exactly those kinds of targets. In another type of war, the M110 might look outdated. In this war, it looks terrifyingly effective, and Ukraine is unlikely to leave the system untouched. One thing Ukraine has repeatedly demonstrated throughout this war is an exceptional ability to modernize, adapt, and improve the Western equipment it receives. It has done so with drones, armored vehicles, air defense systems, and tanks. There is every reason to believe it will look for ways to make the M110 even more useful, whether through battlefield integration, fire coordination improvements, or new tactical roles. A Cold War giant has entered the war in Ukraine, and Russia may soon learn just how deadly an old weapon can be when placed in the hands of an army that knows exactly how to use it. If Putin wants to keep fighting with mass assaults and battlefield methods that feel dragged out of another era, Ukraine now has a gun built to punish exactly that kind of warfare. And that could make Russia's next offensive even more costly than the last. If you want more analysis on the weapons, tactics, and battlefield innovations reshaping this war, subscribe to the Global Brief so you do not miss what comes next.